Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is an interesting game. An ambitious, independent endeavor to make an indie Elder Scrolls. There's a lot of cool stuff in it, but also, unfortunately, it undermines itself with hidden lore in its golden ending that seems to sabotage its central themes. The game's various weaknesses in gameplay and world design are apparently being worked on, with new Act 3 content planned to be patched in soon, but I doubt my quibbles with the overarching story will be solved. The game's thematic collapse interests me, but there's good stuff too, and I want to talk about both. Huge thanks to Questline for sending me a free copy, by the way. They emailed me shortly after my Veilguard video came out, when I was an even tinier channel than I am now, offering to send me a free copy of the game. I said, hey, as long as you're cool with me not promising to actually make any content out of it unless I have something to say, and they said, yeah, sure, here's a key, no strings attached. That's pretty cool of them. But anyway, yeah, disclaimer, I got this game for free. I did enjoy it. I think it's probably worth checking out after maybe a couple more patches. I just also have some notes. In the spirit of the game having lots of cool stuff that doesn't fully cohere in the most satisfying way, I have a bunch of assorted thoughts on this game that don't necessarily feed into a single thesis, but I do want to bring up before getting into the whole theme stuff. Unless the thesis is that classic saying, the whole is lesser than the sum of its parts. Really makes you think. Whatever. I'll start out with spoiler-free observations before getting into why Act 2 is the highlight for me, and then finally get into why the ending, in my estimation, fails to stick the landing on the cool ideas leading up to it. One thing I won't talk about though is bugs. Yes, the game has had issues with bugs, and that did cause me to pause my playthrough during Act 3 for a few days until it was fixed, but I seem to have avoided most of the worst ones. The first thing that struck me is that the aesthetics of this game, being grimdark fantasy with understandably limited graphical fidelity due to the developer's indie status, feel like a throwback to the gritty, self-serious Xbox 360 era. This is dark fantasy, emphasis on the dark, cue that Marilyn Manson song they used for the Dragon Age Origins trailer. The second thing that struck me is that after you make it through the grimy torture prison that is the tutorial, the first act in the Horns of the South is very frequently a comedic farce. Seriously, or I guess not seriously. From the demon merchant O'Quinn Cinnamon Sage, who is doing the hello fellow human I love being a human shtick.
Hey, of course I'm human. I was born in a human village and my mother was a human. We lived in a house. It had a roof.
To a majority of the interactions you have with the keepers, like the guy who is obsessed with seagulls or the extremely boring museum guide, to the side quest that leads you to the undead chef who gives you the spell to turn people into cheese, to the main quest taking you to the quirky necromancer who's not actually trying to conquer anybody, thank you very much, the first act of this game is silly, sometimes in a Terry Pratchett playing with fantasy tropes kind of way, but sometimes it's just zany. It's far less serious in tone than some of its more visually colorful, allegedly less edgy contemporaries. A pretty common enemy bark line is just a flesh wound. I guess if you want to do an Arthurian game, there's going to be some Monty Python reference in there somewhere.
I've heard worse.
Are Monty Python and the Holy Grail references cool again? When I was growing up, they were all over the internet until they got completely oversaturated and dull. But because of that, everyone knew to avoid them, and now it's been ages since I've seen one out in the wild. So are they fresh again? Probably not.
You make me sad.
But I guess it's another thing that feels like a throwback to the early 2010s. Also, there's a bounty quest to hunt down an ogre that's named after a Shrek line. My remarks about the constant comedy are not complaints, for the record. I think it's surprisingly fun that this dour-looking game has such lively humor in it, especially in the first act. And there is certainly a way to read the comedy as tragic. The wackiness of everyone in the Keeper Fortress can be seen as expressions of how broken these people are. The cast-offs of Camelot, which is spelled with a K in this world for some reason, who have been sent to this disrespected fortress to rot out of the sight of respectable society, and have lost their minds and dignity in the meantime. This game has pretty good quests overall. The NPCs are extremely, hello stranger, let me immediately spill my life story for you with little prompting, which is contrived, but much of the time these stories are interesting, and that kind of interaction is just part of this genre. The quests often have at least a cool idea to present, and involve an interesting location or interaction with a neat NPC. In other words, they're good, solid side quests. I haven't played the Oblivion remaster, and I doubt I will for a while, but I did replay the 2009 Game of the Year version version just last year, and for all the praise that game's side quests get, I think a lot of them are coasting on cool concepts that the actual presentation and limited quest design can't live up to. With a handful of exceptions, such as the Dark Brotherhood plot, Tainted Grail is, I feel, generally much better about this. For one thing, its dialogue system is better than Oblivion's for sure, though usually not as in-depth as something like, say, Avowed's. Sometimes you'll get a long list of possible options with different stat checks for different ways to persuade people, and I'm always a fan of this in RPGs. This tends to pop up when resolving a given situation, if you have to convince someone of something and a couple different tactics are presented to you. But for things like introductions or lines that just move a conversation along, it usually gets more limited to variations on either "let's move on" or "wait, what did you just say?" In these moments it can feel like what you might see in Skyrim, without much freedom to define and roleplay your character through conversation. The fact that these more expansive options do happen, and happen reasonably often, is good, but it's not as frequent as an Obsidian game or an Owlcat game. Speaking of Obsidian and Avowed, when Questline first reached out to me, I went to look up this game and saw a number of YouTube videos talking about its early access like, "This is what Avowed should have been." I'm assuming because Fall of Avalon looks grimdark and has a very rudimentary NPC schedule and theft system, while Avowed just wasn't interested in that. The games do lend themselves to comparison, since both are first-person RPGs mimicking Elder Scrolls, and neither of them really recreate the systemic simulation features Elder Scrolls games are so good at, but also both of them are better written and have better role-playing than Skyrim and Oblivion. Both have directional dash dodges to make melee combat more kinetic, and both divide up their open worlds into distinct zones rather than being one big continuous map, which is, I think, a big part of why the exploration element doesn't live up to Elder Scrolls. Both even narratively revolve around the player character being spiritually attached to an older entity with a complicated past. But now that I've played both Avowed and Tainted Grail, I'm just like, oh cool, 2 cakes.
I'm just wondering which one you like more.
I like them both.
You can't have both.
Yes, you can.
Not in this question.
Too bad.
Tainted Grail is much more reasonably priced, though, and expense would be a valid reason why you can't actually have both. Also, earlier I may have implicitly dismissed Tainted Grail's art direction as just PS3 dark fantasy, but it's actually pretty decent. For the environments, Fall of Avalon uses familiar-looking dark fantasy aesthetics, but uses them well, especially when the Four-Dweller ruins are interspersed with the crumbling towers of Camelocian make. In this version of Arthurian legend, King Arthur brought his subjects over the sea with him from somewhere called the Homelands, because that place was ravaged by a disease called the Red Plague. He decided to found Camelot on this new island of Avalon, but there were already otherworldly, multi-armed, reality-bending people living there. The Four-Dwellers. Arthur led a war against the Four-Dwellers to secure Camelot's foundation and drive away the strange, magical stuff of creation called the Weirdness that is pretty harmful to humanity, and he almost completely wiped out the Four-Dwellers while doing so. Art design-wise, the Four-Dweller architecture is very H.R. Geiger, which lends an extra element to the crumbling castles, huts, and farms that make up your standard medieval dark fantasy landscape. Oh, and yes, the lore is turning King Arthur from a Briton king who rose to power to bring order to his own homeland into a conqueror who built his kingdom on the bones of a species he slaughtered in order to steal their land. And then he broke promises to his Dalriada and giant allies and oppressed them because they didn't fit his narrow view of what proper Camelot society should be. Apparently his vision for Camelot involves misogyny, since the Dalriada are presented as much more egalitarian than Camelot. The game turns classic elements of Arthurian myth, like the healing island of Avalon and Arthur going to sleep to return in his kingdom's time of need, into elements of horror. How boldly deconstructionist of this game to twist this virtuous pillar of English cultural legend into an embodiment of the destruction of conquest, oppression, and devotion to a single mythologized figurehead. Some things made me wonder why Arthurian legend was chosen if they decided to be so divergent with the mythology. For one thing, the cutscene showing Arthur's resurrection involves the singers talking about Norse mythology, which is completely irrelevant here. And I guess this is really a question about the existing Tainted Grail franchise, which started as a board game by Krzysztof Piskorski, since Fall of Avalon would have inherited this setting. But still, a lot of old names from Arthurian mythology are repurposed for completely different characters. The whole Fordweller thing was completely made up. The characters in the world worship the Allmother instead of being Christians like the Arthurian characters are generally understood to be. I mean, the franchise is called Tainted Grail, as in the Holy Grail, and in this game, the Holy Grail is mentioned as an important relic that some side characters can go off to quest for. But our original legend is that the Holy Grail was Jesus Christ's cup from the Last Supper, so what is the Holy Grail supposed to be in this world? Well, actually, the development of the Arthurian legend from Celtic and Welsh non-Christian mythologies muddies the waters of what the Holy Grail originally was, and debates over this origin have been present in academia for a very long time, but the Grail is related to Jesus in modern times at the very least. I can't speak for how the Arthurian references work for the previous installments of this franchise, but in this game specifically, drawing on such a familiar legend only to make it barely recognizable maybe has thematic resonance for the game's central ideas about the distortion of myth and how we view our heroes over time. And the way the game twists the idea that Arthur will return in the kingdom's time of need, the idea of him as the once and future king, is a cool play on the older myths that does gain more meaning by comparing it to the source material. The actual plot, as is set up by the end of the prologue, is that after forging Camelot in the blood of the land's original inhabitants and many of his own followers, King Arthur died, but has been repeatedly brought back from the dead by Camelot's red priests in futile attempts to stave off the kingdom's decay. The fog of the weirdness is returning. The light of the menhirs, Fordweller statues that keep it at bay, is dimming. The Red Death Plague that drove Arthur to travel to Avalon and decide to conquer it in the first place has followed his people. So, Arthur is being brought back to life once again, with the player character shoved into the role of being a vessel for a fragment of Arthur's soul, and then forced to go around collecting all the other fragments to combine into a complete, hopefully fully resurrected Arthur. However, combining these fragments also makes it easy to kill Arthur forever, which is what the man who rescues you from the prison at the start of the game, Caradoc, wants to do. He wants to free Avalon from the tyranny of Arthur's memory at all costs. I like this premise a lot. It's a fascinating way to explore the power of myth in a negative light, how clinging to one central figure as the only hero worth having in a culture does not stave off decay, it accelerates it. The game is torn between following this theme through and, eventually not. But we'll get there later. Suffice it to say for now that the setup for the story is great, with Arthur tagging along for your journeys in a manner that I understand is like Johnny Silverhand in Cyberpunk 2077. I only just now picked up that game at the time of writing and haven't started it yet. There are a lot of opportunities to talk to him about how much Camelot has strayed from his ideals of what it should be, and how his efforts to set up a mighty kingdom that would last forever have essentially failed, and in many ways guaranteed the failure that he was trying to avoid. These conversations can unfortunately get repetitive, with his thoughts very often being, "Wow, everything sure is worse now," or "I did what I had to do because the war was brutal, get off my case about my war crimes." He does, however, truly want the best for his kingdom and his people, and it's clear that despite his willingness to engage in cruelty, he didn't just want power for power's sake. He didn't conquer Avalon just to conquer it, he was leading his people away from plague and for unclear reasons decided that coexisting with the Fordwellers was impossible. This doesn't excuse the atrocities he committed, of course, but it does make the nature of his conquest fundamentally different than mere territorial expansion. He is simply a man who refused to self-reflect in life, under the belief that being anything but unflinchingly ruthless was a weakness, and is shocked that both he and his kingdom have decayed since his death. Moving on to Act 2, spoilers for the Kuanacht region now, by the way. This area is my favorite in the game, despite its comparative lack of polish. The area quest where the player bringing Arthur to the town reignites the local menhir causes a much more interesting plotline than the one in the Horns. The town is dealing with Camelot's efforts to uproot everybody and bring all the island's menhirs to the capital city to try to stave off the increasing weirdness. Now that the townsfolk have been given hope to keep their homes and resist Camelot's ultimately selfish efforts to close ranks around itself, what outcome will the player push for? There's a lot more at play here than in the Horns of the South, which does have a decent plot development with the Keeper's captain trying to ally with One-Eye's Dalriada tribe, but otherwise feels like just a side quest hub. There's more chewy local politics in Kuanacht, and the character of Maggot the Druid has a good personal arc if you choose to help him. I did like the comedy of Act 1 a lot, but the actual stories in Kuanacht are just more interesting. And it's not like the comedy has completely disappeared. The guy with the fireworks is a little silly, and the side quest where you have to find out who stole the bookshop's offerings of porn is simultaneously humorous and surprisingly thoughtful, as you, if you want to get the porn back, have to debate scripture to convince the repressed priest who stole it that it isn't actually sinful to pleasure yourself through a unique dialogue puzzle. Even with these quirkier moments, melancholia and tragedy are much more prominent in this region, especially with the main quests that you have to do to get the two Menhir tablets. These are not only the best quests in this game, but some of my favorite RPG quests in general from recent years. While the game as a whole is pretty good, these two quests are standout moments. The Corrupted Temple is a journey into a temple of priestesses to the All-Mother that have been essentially possessed by an entity in the guise of their goddess. The music is ethereal. The notes you find on the bodies of the priestesses you kill asserting their real identities and praying for the release of death are tragic. And the reveal of who this false All-Mother turns out to be is really cool. The one drawback is that the layout of this temple can get a little confusing, and after finishing the quest I spent like an extra 15 minutes trying to retrace my steps to find the exit. Since there's no map for indoor areas, and despite visually being outside, the game treated the zone as indoors since it was separate from the overworld. The other half of the Menhir tablet is found in the Abyss of Sagramor, a kingdom sunk beneath the earth when its king, Sagramor, married one of the three Bandruri witch sisters who, naturally, align with the Mother Maiden Crone paradigm of witches. Sagramor declared his kingdom independent from Camelot, and to protect him, his wife, the new queen, sunk their castle beneath the earth and froze everybody there in immortality. I particularly like the part of this quest where you go into the writings of the youngest of these sisters, Claire, and see the different romantic stories she has concocted to escape from her immortal monotony. For some reason, though, at the end, the king quotes the "tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow" speech from Macbeth, and I have no idea why.
There will be no legends told of this place, for it is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
I guess there are some superficial similarities with Macbeth, but nothing substantial. Really took me out of the moment. But aside from that, another fantastic quest. Between these two main story vignettes, the Porn Priest and a few other cool side quests, and the decently interesting local politics of the central town, Kuanacht is my favorite part of the game. Act 3, Forlorn Swords, is a downgrade, but there are still bright spots. Spoilers for the Forlorn Swords area now, by the way. It's a shame that the main look we get at the Dal Riata feels kind of lacking, and also a shame that the region with the greatest number of towns still feels empty. There's supposed to be a big patch coming to add many more side quests, but I don't know if side quest is the problem so much as the towns all being small and the region in general being much more visually samey than the previous two. Also, the voice direction seems pretty inconsistent about whether it's pronounced Dal Rita or Dal Riata. At first, it seemed like the Dal Riata themselves pronounced it as Riata, while the Camelocians pronounced it as Rita, which was a cool attention to detail. But the further in the game you get, the more Dal Riata themselves pronounce it as Rita, so it makes it seem like a mistake. The name is taken from an actual Gallic kingdom, and Wikipedia's pronunciation guide says Dal Riata, for what that's worth. But I said there were some bright spots. The main quest in this area explores questions of whether or not the various Dal Riata tribes should maintain certain traditions or let them go for the sake of survival and evolution. In all cases, convincing the tribes to evolve will also make them willing to band together against Camelot, and securing this alliance is the ostensible goal of the main quest of the area. The game doesn't necessarily portray undermining Camelot as the good option and helping it as the evil option, and one could play the game with the belief that restoring the kingdom's dominance and even helping resurrect Arthur is the way to make things better. But the presentation of Camelot really seems to encourage a more anarchistic response. Since its history is bloody, its current leaders are tyrants trying to consolidate power and abandon everyone else, and even their most sympathetic representatives in Kuanacht are often a bit too haughty for their own good. Camelot is consistently presented as rotten and immoral, corrupt and abusive towards the regions you visit, and Forlorn Swords is littered with evidence of atrocities they have committed against the Dal Riata. Fighting them doesn't always mean making choices that makes everybody happy, but everything we see certainly portrays them as closer to the greater evil in every scenario. Of the 4 Dalriada tribe questlines in this act, the best one is by far the Thoid tribes. All the Dalriada worship the slumbering giants whom Arthur also tricked and enslaved in order to conquer Avalon, and bound most of them to the commands of his magic crown. However, some giants still watch over their towns, and the giant who takes the position of the Thoid's mother is attempting to bring the whole tribe into a dream world with her, to leave the decaying Avalon behind and survive in some form even after the weirdness consumes the whole land. The Thoid's mother is a great character. I especially like when Arthur actually leaves your body to talk to her directly. Certainly the highlight of the region. Perhaps the biggest disappointment of Act 3 is that it's the last part of the game, and we never actually get to go to Camelot.
On second thoughts, let's not go to Camelot. It is a silly place.
We are now entering spoilers for the endgame. It feels like we've been building up to getting to actually visit the rotten capital of the kingdom, really getting to confront the people who sent the latest Sir Galahad to burn the traitors in the Horns of the South, and who ordered all the menhirs gathered up even if it meant condemning Avalon's other settlements to destruction, and who waged war in the Forlorn Swords and destroyed Gareth Hanner's tribe. This would also give us a clear sense of how the current leaders view Arthur, how they're influenced by his legend, which would be a critical part of evaluating the king's legacy. It seems like such an obvious finale. There's even a gate to the region in Kuanacht that currently goes unused. I can only assume that it will be added in future DLC, but for now I'll take the game as it is, with no trip to Camelot at all. Instead, what happens to Camelot is determined by whether you unite the Dalriada tribes, and if you use Arthur's crown to send the giants to help them assault the capital. You, meanwhile, are focused entirely on what to do with King Arthur's now unified soul. This almost casts Camelot itself as irrelevant in the face of everything else, dragging the once mighty castle down to narrative powerlessness to complement the in-universe political decay.
It's only a model. Shh.
The player character basically destroys what Camelot has become, either by liberating the rest of Avalon or by totally revitalizing it, without ever stepping foot in the castle, or city, or whatever the name refers to in this universe. Its current rulers remain unseen to us, even as we directly deal with the impact of the decisions they make locked away in safety, and presumably decadence, but honestly, maybe things are sparse and sucky there too. And by dealing with their efforts in the wider world, we don't even need to directly confront them to defang them. There's something powerful in that idea, though it's not fleshed out in a way that feels purposeful. And like I said, I'm pretty sure the area is going to be added later. It's certainly unsatisfying right now to be teased with notions of what Camelot is like and prompted to wonder about its current leadership, only to never have that be relevant after meeting Galahad in Act 1. The story establishes that the Knights of the Round Table are titles passed down to the kingdom's next group of leaders. But we get more of a sense of who the original knights were if we visit their optional tombs and interact with their ghosts than we do about who's holding the positions now. Galahad is the only current one we face. Well, him and maybe Percival. I forget how long the corrupted temple has been corrupted, so there may already be another Percival. And the Percival we meet is at least mostly heroic, so if she's gone, that implies interesting things about maybe the Knights of the Round Table losing a moderating voice. The inner workings of this corrupt legacy round table sound interesting, so I wish we could see it. As I said, the game's climax is interested in Arthur and what you do with his soul. Those who want him resurrected believe that uniting all the fragments will actually work this time, since the previous degraded resurrections were only single parts of him. Caradoc insists that Arthur must die, even if this means the people of Avalon lose their last remaining legend, because they must either form new legends or fall on their own. Given what we've learned about Arthur throughout the game, his crimes and his genuinely sympathetic intentions behind them, and his previous inability to properly reckon with them, and what his kingdom has become clinging to his myth, it seems like Caradoc's view is the one the rest of the game most supports. Avalon cannot become like Sagramor's kingdom, locked in agonizing stasis forever. It must be freed from Arthur's legacy. However, there is a secret golden ending, and this is where I feel the game falls apart thematically. 3 optional areas that you need the region's Arthur fragments to access reveals to you the truth behind the Red Plague, Arthur, and the Foredwellers. As it turns out, one Foredweller, the Pale Lady, saw humanity in their homelands and was fascinated by their mortality, in contrast to the immortality of the Foredwellers who lived amongst and could actively manipulate the energy of the weirdness. So the Pale Lady had a child forged in the image of humanity, who was even more obsessed with humanity than she, and started making menhirs to drive the weirdness away so humans could come and live on their island. The other Four Dwellers panicked and killed this child. The child reincarnated as Arthur, a human with a Four Dweller soul, and his mother's grief caused the Red Plague to begin where he lived. Arthur followed her call to Avalon, prompting his conquest of the island and wielding the menhirs to drive the weirdness away and slaughter almost the entire Four Dweller people. The Pale Lady still lives, though, and her separation from her son's actual Four Dweller form keeps the Red Plague simmering until it reaches Avalon, prompting the events of the game. The process of discovering this gives you a method to ascend Arthur's recompiled soul back into Four Dweller form, which basically fixes everything related to Arthur and the weirdness and the Red Plague forever. I don't know if what I'm about to say is an accurate guess into the authorial reasoning for this element, but it seems to me like the sort of thing that would happen when someone wants to have cool, deep lore and forgets about what that lore would mean for the thematic coherence of the story they're working with. I, of course, have my own moral biases I'm bringing into this game, but it really does seem like the storytelling outside of these Four Dweller reveals hammers home the idea that King Arthur was just a man who lost himself to the warping nature of power, and his kingdom posthumously clinging to his image, forcing him to be more than he was, and bringing him back repeatedly is accelerating the fall of Avalon. Arthur tried to forge a home for his people in the face of existential threat, and used his noble intentions to justify his wartime tunnel vision, and the atrocities he committed or authorized as a result. But behind it all, Arthur was just a man. The embodiment of his mortal humanity that you find in the game's finale drives this home, begging you to allow him to pass on for all the reasons just described.
I've been dragged through every dream, every lie they've built around me. And I'm tired. Tired of the weight, of the expectations, of all of it.
But then this golden ending reveal says actually Arthur was not just a man. He really was a special boy with the soul of a demigod, and the domino chain between his Four Dweller self getting killed by his peers and his Arthur self returning to conquer Avalon reframes the Four Dwellers as sowing the seeds of their own destruction in a way that implicitly, partially, absolves Arthur. Not entirely, of course. He let Merlin torture his followers to research immortality and betray the Dalriada and giants of his own volition. But still, my point is that rather than following through on deconstructing Arthur's legend, the game ends up replacing it with an even more fantastical one. I hope I'm not just annoyed because the story didn't end up having the themes I wanted from it. I like to think I'm good with sitting with that feeling and working through it like I did with Clair Obscur, instead of just dismissing it all as poorly done. With Tainted Grail, though, it really does feel like this golden ending flies in the face of everything else the game is setting up about who Arthur is otherwise characterized as. A flawed, complicated, very human king who tried to be a good leader but allowed himself to lose his humanity to the pressures of royalty and myth. Him being a Four Dweller feels like a cop-out. It feels like an attempt to throw in a twist just to have a twist. I do want to try to find a more coherent reading of this. If the point is that Arthur is misjudged, and that Caradoc and a player sympathetic to Caradoc have come to a destructive conclusion based on incomplete information, then what could that mean? Maybe it means that to truly solve problems you have to take the effort to look deeper than the surface-level dichotomy you're presented with. But that's just every RPG that lets you find hidden solutions, and it has nothing to do with what Arthur's true nature says about him as king or his legend. Maybe this element brushes up against divine right of king stuff, since Arthur was literally born superhuman and uniquely capable of defeating the Four Dwellers. But that doesn't quite work because the golden ending is him abandoning humanity to return to his mother's side, thus abdicating his royal role forever. And if he was never born special, then there would never have been a problem to begin with. Maybe it's that two different groups of people can never get along and are best separated, since the Four Dwellers inadvertently caused the Red Plague because Arthur's mother was too interested in humanity, and humanity couldn't survive on Avalon with the weirdness around them that the Four Dwellers lived with, causing humanity to destroy them, and then leading to humanity almost dying to the weirdness unless the remaining Four Dwellers leave. I suppose that concept makes sense with the facts of the story, even if it completely flies in the face of my own worldview, but it's so out of left field within the context of the game, especially since the first area involves the possibility for a peaceful alliance between the Keepers and One-Eye's Dalriada faction. Though maybe there's something to that Divine Right of Kings stuff. The game might be invoking the idea of the Divine Right of Kings for horror, rather than to justify him as a righteous ruler. His Four Dweller soul is what drew the Red Plague to humanity's homelands. It's why the Pale Lady called him to Avalon and even gave him Excalibur, which implies that she may have wanted him to wipe out the other Four Dwellers. Though she denies this desire if you point out that she was responsible for her people's death. Arthur's Four Dweller soul is what allows Merlin's experiments to work, to make him immortal, and thus someone who can be summoned and distorted into a monster repeatedly. So this reveal could actually reframe the story as exploring the horrific implications of what might happen if a king really was supernaturally special by birth. A thought experiment leading to the conclusion that if the Divine Right of Kings were true, it would be terrible for everybody. And the golden ending makes it clear that the world would be better off without a king like Arthur. I like this reading, though it still doesn't feel quite right. So much of the main story is about exploring Arthur's humanity and tearing down this myth. So even though I've managed to interpret the golden ending in a way that continues the idea of a dark fantasy deconstruction, it feels like a parallel but incompatible take on Arthur rather than a complementary one. The game already presents a possibility for Arthur gaining a Four Dweller soul without him being the reincarnation of one, since Merlin's experiments that led to the king's immortality involve experimenting on Four Dwellers and infusing Arthur with their essence. If not for the Pale Lady explicitly stating that Arthur is the direct reincarnation of her son, I would have accepted that Arthur may have simply been fused with that son by Merlin. Maybe there's just something I'm missing. It took me a bit to come to the "this plot point is playing the Divine Right of Kings for horror actually" idea, so maybe with time, or with feedback from you in the comments, faithful viewer, I can better refine my reading. But for now, it feels to me like an example of the writers wanting a cool twist about deep lore, and failing to account for how this sabotages the thematic coherence of the main story as they established it throughout the rest of the game. It's a reminder that cool lore for its own sake can be narratively destructive rather than beneficial. Thanks again for the free copy of the game, Questline. I hope you're not too mad. I did truly enjoy my time with it. It's a fun adventure with plenty of good quests along the way, and if the golden ending is just ignored, then maybe the world isn't in as healthy a state, but the narrative will be. Up to the player what to prioritize, I guess. Thank you for watching. Comment a bell and a like on my subscribe, and I would be most grateful. Huge thanks to my Patreon backers, whose names you can see on screen here. I just added a new reward for all tiers, where I write up mini non-video essays about media I have some thoughts on, but not enough for a full video. If you're interested in that, or contributing to and seeing private Q&A videos, or getting to see script previews of these videos before they're out, then maybe you'd want to look into being a supporter yourself. Either way, thank you again for watching, and have a good one.